Tenkhoff from Hollywood. Karen Tenkhoff, and I'll tell you a little bit more about her bio because you may not know her. She began her career in the motion pictures and film industry. She was the producing partner to Robert Redford at Wildwood Enterprises. And Karen produced and executive produced some incredible features, including The Horse Whisperer, The Legend of Bagger Vance, and my favorite, The Motorcycle Diaries. So thank you for joining us, Karen. Maybe if you could talk a little bit about reflecting on what he said about The Horse Whisperer.
I just want to add a little bit to, can you hear me?
Oh.
To what Rohan said about if you are making a film that's specifically about the issue, there's a word for these films and they're called propaganda. And that's not the business that any of us really want to be in. We're in the business of being entertaining and hopefully educational as well. And if you're in, as he says, it can be a subliminal or small story thread, need not be the subject of your film. But if it's there, you want to get it right. And when I look at, I can give you an experience from my life as a producer. I give you a story from, I was making this film with Robert Redford called The Horse Whisperer, which was based on a best-selling novel of the same name. It was very well known, and the young protagonist, who at that time was a 12-year-old Scarlett Johansson, who has gone on to much bigger and better things. But her character in the film was in a terrible accident and lost her leg. And so she had to have her leg amputated. Now, the conventional Hollywood approach would be like, great, we'll get the prop guy, he'll figure it out. And then, but that's not responsible filmmaking. So what I was asked to do was find out what would really happen if a 12-year-old girl is in a terrible accident like this. And what is the process? Now, most of that you never see on film. I'm not making a documentary about orthopedic surgery and amputation, but I had a responsibility to give to my director and all of his crew the exact data and facts about what really happens, so that 0.1% that does appear on screen, how her leg was bandaged, what the doctor said to her mother, that was in fact accurate. And at the time, this was before Hollywood Health and Society had launched in Los Angeles, and before the internet was widely available. And so I had no choice but to literally go in the phone book. I needed to find an orthopedic surgeon who would talk to me. So I start calling people on the phone. Hi, I'm calling from Robert Redford's office. Nobody believes me. I say, oh, right, you're calling from Robert Redford's office. Finally, I find a nice orthopedic surgeon who did believe me, who was willing to have me come in, allow me to document and photograph how the process they go through. I sat with them like a journalist to find out the truth of what they do, what they would do in this exact situation. And then with that data, came back to the production. Now we have this amazing institute in Los Angeles that many of my colleagues and that I have used that makes that specific process so much easier. And it's an incredible resource. And it all borders on being too good to be true because there's no expense to the production. But it's because the people on the other end, the doctors, the scientists, are so happy to have the truth of what they do every day amplified responsibly around the globe. And if you're a doctor who faces this kind of thing, whether it's addiction, climate change, science, whatever it is, you've spent your life becoming an expert in that. The last thing you want to do is see it portrayed falsely in something that will last forever and become global. And so there's an incredible willingness. What we need is the bridge. And the Third Eye, I'm so pleased to be part of this, that the Third Eye will bring that to India, that has one of the most vibrant content creating industries in the world. And to have this resource, I think will allow you as content creators to do the storytelling you're already doing, but to transcend it to an even newer and more compelling level. My perspective comes only from my professional life, and I don't speak for Hollywood in any way. But I think that the idea of speaking about the unspoken or the difficult, one of the great ways that can, and this will relate to Rohan's work, one of the things that can make this more palatable to people is humor and comedy. and some of the most difficult subjects. I mean, oftentimes the instinct is to make a documentary. And and I love documentaries and nothing, I'm grateful for all the documentarians in the world, but it can be very challenging to reach a broader audience. I have colleagues who work on The Simpsons who undertaken all manner of very difficult issues, from climate change, environmental issues.
Vasectomy.
Yeah, vasectomy issues, as Sandra says, who've undertaken all kinds of almost unspeakable issues, but because they're doing it on The Simpsons, if Bart Simpson says it or Homer Simpson says it, and it's funny. There are many approaches to filmmaking, as all of you know, and as Carol is speaking specifically from the television perspective. And in film, it's of course a bit different in that there are so many different types of films, different types of filmmakers, and you have a much smaller, shorter amount of time to get something specific across. And I've heard from many folks today how Indian audiences in particular are not going to pay hard-earned money to be preached to or to hear a message in a film. And I think that that's incredibly understandable worldwide, and that people work hard for their money and they're going to be entertained, and there's a certain element of escapism that is part of entertainment. And we have a responsibility to our audiences. And as one of the panelists said today, though, our audiences aren't morons either. And so I think there's, where that balance lies, it's up to each individual filmmaker. I brought an example today from a film that I helped produce called The Motorcycle Diaries, which is a film about the young Che Guevara, who, before he became revolutionary Che Guevara, was a young medical student named Ernesto. And he and his best friend, Alberto, decided that before Alberto turned 30, the ripe age of 30, that they wanted to take a motorcycle journey the length of South America. Now that particular journey ended up changing Ernesto's life, and the rest of his story is well known and well documented by history. As a question of social justice and politics, the movie actually took no position on this one way or the other. This is a story of a young man coming into his own political consciousness. And it wasn't saying what he did later was right or wrong. It was just saying these are the elements that helped inform those decisions. And the larger film itself was really about social justice and compassion, and where does each individual's responsibility lie. But for us, as the filmmaking team, the hope was to find a character and create a character who's based on a true person. So we had obligations to his heirs and his family. His wife still lives in Cuba. His friend Alberto is still a living person who was being portrayed in the film. So we had moral and ethical obligations to the real lives of those people, but we also had an obligation to the audience to create a character who's hopefully compelling and entertaining and charismatic enough to make them feel entertained over the course of what could seem like an overtly political movie. Now, how this relates to health is that within this film, there's a small scene that I'm about to show that has a very specific public health element to it, and after we roll it, I can talk a little bit more about it and how it came about.
Doctor, entonces, ¿cuántos pacientes viven en la zona sur? Casi 600. No, peruanos. No, la gran mayoría, pero también hay de Colombia, de Venezuela y de otros países de Sudamérica. Yo soy Alberto Granado.
Doctor, ¿qué magnífico la regla?
Mucho gusto.
Papá Carlito es jefe de la comunidad. Ellos son médicos argentinos.
Encantado, ¿eh?
Bien,
Hasta luego.
son unos caballeros.
The film itself is clearly not about leprosy. But, first of all, that really happened. That event is well documented in Che's actual diaries of the journey. And it was very impactful for him personally because he was facing something that was not an actual medical issue being passed off as one. It was really a political issue of bigotry, of like, these people are not as good as us, they have to live over here, you can't touch them because, well, it's not really contagious, it's, well, okay, well then it's just really symbolic. So what does that mean? What does that mean dramatically? And so I think in terms of creating scenes that are compelling, what I like about this as an example, and I didn't write it so I can say this, the writer did a great job, that we have a protagonist who has a certain point of view that's very authentic to him, and his compatriot who holds the same point of view. And then who are the obstacles to that point of view being carried forward for them? Well, there's a doctor who's the senior doctor who's fairly reasonable and kind of like, well, I don't really want to have to do this. But then there's the nuns across the water who are clearly the antagonists, even though they're wordless, they don't say anything, they don't actually confront them in any way. But having been warned as they go across the river, just the one look from the one nun is enough to know that like these guys are not really welcome. And I think it's arguably fairly amusing for anyone who I was raised Catholic, so there's a sort of, the familiarity of nuns being very judgmental has a certain comedic value for some people. So I think that it's an illustration to me of what is necessary in any scene with just good writing. Again, I didn't write this, but where you have a protagonist with a certain point of view who's met with obstacles to that point of view, but they're presented with sort of equal weight. It wasn't just that he's so holy that he says, oh, I'm not going to befriend those people. It's that the other point of view was presented as somewhat unreasonable, but presented nonetheless. And so, for me, that's the difference between like good drama and just propaganda. It's that you actually are presenting all characters' points of view with a certain level of respect and authenticity for who they come from. So like those nuns come by their opinions honestly. That's really what they thought was the right thing. It's not because they're bad people. It's because the set of beliefs that they have been given. And so I think as filmmakers, there's a responsibility simply to represent the authenticity of character point of view, whether protagonist, antagonist, or somewhere in between. And where do we get those authentic points of view? We get them from research. We get them from the stories that we hear in the field are usually better than anything I can come up with. Now, maybe that's just me, maybe I have a limited imagination, but I think it's true of a lot of people, because we might be spending a year working on a screenplay, but if you have the benefit of talking to someone who's spending their lifetime dealing with whatever issue that you're putting in your screenplay, as I spoke about this morning, about talking to an orthopedic surgeon about what it means to have to amputate a young person's or any person's appendage, what does that mean? That's only a very small thing for me, but for them, this is their life's work. And the benefit of being able to connect with people who willingly share their life's work with you means that you have a chance to tell extraordinary stories that no amount of newspaper reading, Googling, Wikipedia reading will ever compare with. And so for me, I actually feel like in some ways it's an incredible shortcut. And a shortcut sounds pejorative in a way that I don't mean for it to. What it means, it's just efficient. There's an efficiency in talking to people who can impart stories to you that help contextualize what you're doing, but often find just the exact moment of authenticity that is where drama lives. And you saw in Carol's clip that we heard that story in South Africa about women doing that. Banging on pots and pans to prevent domestic violence when it happened. And it was like, that was just one thing that was said that turned into that beautiful scene. And so, as much as I've heard that, the feedback from a lot of folks, well, how can it be entertaining? How can it be entertaining? Our hope is by illustrating just in these small examples that it can be entertaining, but it starts really with the research. And just to give you some examples from what I'm doing now as a producer, I now work in animation. In animation, you'd think, okay, it's cartoons. Well, why do you need to do research for cartoons? Well, the studio where I work and the people with whom I work believe that you have to know what you're deviating from in order to really create something that's entertaining and imaginative. So you don't just make things up and put them on the screen. It doesn't mean you have to produce a documentary, an animated documentary of what really happens, but it means that you have to know that if planes fly a certain way and you're choosing to portray them flying a different way because maybe it's funnier or more interesting or serves your story in some way, at least you'll know why. And for me and for all of the crew of people that I work with, we've we've used Hollywood Health and Society not only for medical things, medical storylines, but also scientific related storylines. Right now I'm working on a comedy that takes place in outer space, right? Okay, that has nothing to do outwardly with public health, but Hollywood Health and Society is, as a resource to the industry, has hooked us up with the physicists who work at the Jet Propulsion Lab in Pasadena. And those physicists love talking about the possibilities of time travel, the possibilities of particle physics, things that I barely understand. But for me, as a producer, to be able to take writers and directors to be engaged in that conversation will yield something. I'm not even sure what it is, but it will yield something that will make the story better than it would have been otherwise. And that has been consistently true on every single project I've ever worked on. So I can't encourage you enough. I mean, this is a country, city, well, first of all, a city, and then a country rich with extraordinary stories everywhere you look. But what, as filmmakers, can you do, or as not just filmmakers, content creators, what can you do to make those stories as authentic and realistic as possible? And I'm so happy for you that you now, because I've been the beneficiary of this resource in Los Angeles, that you have this resource now available to you here in Mumbai to tell stories that are specific to you, that are not just trying to emulate Hollywood stories of people whose lives in Beverly Hills or Chicago or New York are different than the lives of the audience here. And I think that that's one of the best ways you can respect your audience, is telling specific stories that resonate with this audience, that it's not about what it's like to be a teenager in a high school in Chicago. It's like, what's it like to be a teenager in a rural village here, or in Mumbai, or both? I don't have those answers, but you do as content creators, and the third eye, I think, can really help you contextualize them even broader with incredible resources.